Hello everyone and welcome to Green Magic, your source for all things green and magic. Alright everyone, so this episode will be about Elves for Mana Dork Ramp, and I do want to make it clear that I don't think that these are generally something that you would want to include one or two of as part of a normal ramp package if you're doing mostly like Cultivates and Kodama Reaches, and you just want to include one or two of these. It doesn't necessarily make sense. I can understand the temptation because you might want to get one of these guys out potentially on turn 1. That way you can do like the Cultivator or whatever on turn 2. If you're looking to... If the way you look at it is that waiting all the way till turn 3 before doing your first ramp spell is too late, that's understandable. But if you're only doing like a couple of these in your ramp package, and you're only doing a ramp package of about 10 cards, then you're not going to consistently get these out early enough to do that, and you're not going to have enough ramp to really be effective in even ramping. So I would suggest, if you are going to go that route where you just want to add these to an existing ramp package, that you just go with like 5 of them and add it on top of the other ones, so you would have like 10 of the land-based ramp things and then 5 of these. But don't do some weird mix where you just have a couple of these and then a few of the land ramps and maybe a couple of something else. It's just not going to be as consistent, effective, or just good in general. Now, the main reason why you'd want to even use a lot of these mana dorks to ramp yourself is if you are either playing Elf Tribal, that's an obvious one, or if you are just playing a creature-centric deck. If you don't really want all those sorceries and everything that get you lands, you want just creatures that get the job done. You want creatures that do the card draw, creatures that do the ramp, creatures that do everything. You want your deck to be almost all creatures, and then whenever you cast, a card draw spell that cares about creatures, here you go. Here's more creatures that'll help you with that. So let's start with the 1-drop elves that will give you mana. Elvish Mystic, Llanowar Elves, Boreal Druid, and Fyndhorn Elves. You can see that Elvish Mystic and Llanowar Elves do see a huge amount of play, and then there is a drop off to Fyndhorn Elves, which sees about half as much play as Elvish Mystic, and then Boreal Druid is pretty well substantially less than that. Now, the only downside to Boreal Druid is it creates a generic mana, or a snow mana, really, a colorless snow mana. So in like a Seton deck, if you happen to get Boreal Druid down on turn 1 as your 1-drop, then you can't play Seton on turn 2 because you would have 2 green from your 2 forests and then a generic, and Seton does require all 3 to be green mana. Other than that, any other point in the game, it's not really going to make any difference. The only other possible time that it can matter is if your creatures have haste, you're down to being able to produce 1 mana, you cast Boreal Druid, you have some sort of draw effect, the draw effect draws you into another 1 mana creature that you can't now cast because Boreal Druid produces colorless. Any other circumstance, it doesn't matter, he's just as good as the other 3. And if you are looking to try and get out of the gate, ramp very early, you'd probably want to include all 4 of these, and also Arbor Elf, because that's another 1 mana thing that does ramp you. It's not a mana dork like these. It'll be featured in another video, but that would go in the same kind of category. Next, let's look at all the 2-drops, and there's quite a few of them. These are all 2-drops, and they all produce 1 mana. Druid of the Cowl straight produces 1 mana. Quirion Explorer gives you a mana of any type that a land an opponent controls could produce. For the most part, that's not going to matter much if you're just playing mono green, because if your opponents happen to have a forest or a green producing land of some type, you get green off her. If they don't, it'll produce some other color, and you just use that to pay the generic mana cost of spells. Beastcaller Savant sees a good amount of play. It has haste, and it allows you to spend mana of any color, which I assume are the 2 benefits to this card that draw it and that makes it appealing to a lot of players. Personally, I don't think that it's really worth it. Obviously, the fact that it produces any color, it doesn't matter much to me. The haste isn't going to make much difference most of the time, and the only time it would even make a difference is on the first turn it comes out. But the fact that it can only be used on a creature spell is an important limitation. I have, I mean, one deck that I can think of that only has 5 non-creature spells, and anything that will say I can't use mana to cast those spells can be a huge downfall. It can really hurt whatever momentum, whatever game plan I might have, not being able to cast one of those when I want to because I'm 1 mana short because something will only give me mana for creatures. So I don't like it for that reason. Servant of the Conduit, unless you're playing an energy-based deck, this one will it comes in with 2 charge counters, and assuming you also don't have a way to proliferate your energy counters, you're only going to be able to tap it for mana twice. So a 2-off mana dork. I don't really like that. I don't think it should see too much play unless you are just absolutely trying to stuff every mana dork into a deck possible. Then it would go into that. But if you're even limiting yourself to 15 or 20 mana dorks, there are 15 or 20 better mana dorks just on this video. Elfhame Druid gives you a mana, and then it also gives you the opportunity for 2 mana if you're playing a kicked spell. Generally, I would just view this as being equal to any of the other 2 mana elves that produce 1 mana, because the kicked part is not going to come up very often, but on the occasion that it does, nice. Quirion Elves gives you either a green mana or another color of your choice. In a monocolor deck, I don't really care about the other effect. If you are playing 2 colors, then that's perfect. It'll give you either color that you might want. If you're playing 3 or more, you can at least have the option for green and one of the other colors. So a little bit beneficial there. But even if you just view it as the same as the other ones where it just produces a mana, it's still, on par with all the others. Woodland Mystic is kind of expensive considering how little play it sees. It's a common from a new set. I don't know why it's so expensive. I think it may have been in those free packs for starters, like those intro decks for new players. And I know that some cards that are in those end up being worth a few bucks because they're not even in a main set. They are strictly in those welcome decks for new players. They don't exist in any mass-produced for sale booster pack, so there's not very many of them out. And I'm going to guess that's the case with this card. I do vaguely remember that being the case, and that would explain why common, this relatively young M20, is so expensive. Leaf Gilder, Wirewood Elf, same thing, 2 mana, produce 1, nothing special. Paradise Druid sees a ton of play, and the only benefit this one has is that it's hexproof when it's untapped. I don't know why so many people would value that. It's not super important to have hexproof on a mana dork. I can understand hexproof on your big 8/8 trampler guy that you actually care about, that's important to your game plan, but the mana dork, that shouldn't really be a deciding factor. Although it is also a newer card, so I can understand if people just happen to have it handy. That's why they would include it in decks, and that's why it's going to show up on EDH Rec with a greater frequency than some of the other ones that are 5, 10, 20 years old. Of this list, though, Heart Warden, I will say, is probably the best. The benefit that it has will come up more often than the other ones. The kick spell, the hexproof, things like that. The fact that you can pay 2 and sack to draw a card can actually be pretty damn handy in a lot of cases. It can really save you if you are really running out of steam and you're just desperate for that extra card to dig a little bit deeper. I wouldn't count it as part of like a vital part of a card draw package, but it just supplements that even a little bit more and keeps propelling you forward. Next are going to be the 3 mana elves that will produce 2 green. So Greenweaver Druid and Fyndhorn Elder are just identical twins. It's kind of weird that Greenweaver Druid sees like 15 to 20% more play than Fyndhorn Elder. I don't understand that. It doesn't make sense. If you're playing one, you should play both. You might as well just look at them as if they have partners with written on them, because there's no reason to have one in your deck and not the other. Then there's Joraga Treespeaker, which sees 4 or 5 times as much play as the other two. And that one actually does make a lot of sense, because because Joraga Treespeaker is paid out in installments, you can get them out on turn 1. On turn 2, pay the 2 to level them up. Then if you happen to have a 1 or 2 drop spell, you can cast it because he'll produce the 2 at that point. And then by turn 3, you have all of your lands and him online. You can produce 5 mana, whereas the other ones are going to come out a little bit slower out of the gate. As the game goes on, they're going to be equal. They'll have cost 3 total and produce 2. So if you cast either one of, Joraga on turn 6 and then you immediately level them up, but then you still have to wait till turn 7 to use them, it'll be the same as casting one of the other 2 on turn 6. But Joraga also has a huge benefit of, once you get them up to level 5, making all of your elves tap for double green. So if you are playing an elf tribal deck, Joraga Treespeaker is absolutely critical to that. Your elf tribal deck isn't necessarily going to be full of mana dorks. It probably should have quite a few, but you might stop before getting the 3 mana produce 2 mana dorks. But you will almost certainly want Joraga Treespeaker to make all of your elves potentially into mana dorks that produce 2 green. Next are going to be the elves that produce mana equal to the number of elves. Priest of Titania, Elvish Archdruid, Wirewood Channeler. They go up in mana and they go way down in play. So Priest of Titania is in almost twice as many decks as Elvish Archdruid, which is in almost 2.5 times as many decks as Wirewood Channeler. I understand, there's a difference between a 2 mana, a 3 mana, and a 4 mana spell that basically do the same thing. But if you're having one, you should probably have all of them. There's really no reason not to. Because even at 4 mana, the most expensive one of this group, it's still going to give you a ton of benefit in an elf deck. And one thing that is worth pointing out with Priest of Titania and Wirewood Channeler is that they qualify for all elves in play. That includes any elves that your opponents might happen to have on the battlefield. And it's not uncommon for them to just have 1 or 2 creatures that do other things or serve some other purpose that happen to be elves. Elvish Archdruid does have the added benefit of buffing all of your creatures. Sometimes that's relevant, sometimes it's not, but it has it. So all 3 if you're playing any one of these, you should probably be playing all 3. There's not much reason to exclude the others. The only reason why I would think that it would matter for the mana cost is if maybe you're playing CDH and you absolutely need the cheapest things possible, and Priest of Titania will fit in that style of gameplay, whereas a 3 or 4 drop won't. But in any casual game, all 3 of them go in an elf deck. And next are going to be the ones that care about how big it is. Viridian Joiner, Marwyn the Nurturer, and Gyre Sage. They each have slightly different ways of going about it, and they will also have something in common with one of the others that the third one won't have. So Viridian Joiner cares about its own power. Marwyn the Nurturer also cares about its own power, but it has a way to build itself up by adding 1/1 counters to it. And it specifically cares about elves. If you're playing a bunch of elves, if you're playing an elf deck, that supports her. And then Gyre Sage also cares about how big it is, but his doesn't even count his base power or any other buffs that he might get. It only cares about the 1/1 counters on him. So while with Viridian Joiner and Marwyn the Nurturer, if you cast a Wild Growth on them, that'll add 3 extra power to them, and they'll tap for 3 extra mana. If you have any kind of Anthem effects, if you have an Overrun or anything like that, that will increase their power and therefore increase the amount of mana that Viridian Joiner and Marwyn the Nurturer produce. It doesn't work that way with Gyre Sage. With Marwyn the Nurturer and Gyre Sage, they both have ways to buff themselves up. Marwyn, of course, like I said, she cares about elves, and the more elves that you have out, the bigger she'll get, or the more elves that you play after her. So she will get bigger off that. Gyre Sage just cares about big creatures coming out. If you have anything bigger than her, then she will get another 1/1 counter. both Marwyn and Gyre Sage would also benefit greatly from proliferate effects and anything that will just put 1/1 counters on your creatures. Or, any deck that has a lot of 1/1 effects. More so with Gyre Sage because Marwyn usually prefers to get her 1/1 counters from elves. Gyre Sage would either want big creatures or proliferate effects or a lot of spells and stuff that care about 1/1 counters, a 1/1 counter centric deck. I think that's more or less the bulk of what I can say about those. The reason I'll point out that you see a lot more Gyre Sage play than the other two is because Marwyn cares about elves primarily. It's kind of limited to those types of decks because Viridian Joiner needs buffs from other sources. It's going to be the most limited because you need a deck that will buff stuff up and will somehow want to buff him up rather than other things. So it's not even like a Voltron thing. And then Gyre Sage is the most applicable because if you're playing big creatures, he goes in that. If you're playing Proliferate, it goes in that. If you're playing anything with 1/1 counters in general, it'll go in that. If you're playing elves, it'll go in that. It has more diversity. Next, I want to talk about the 3 mana elves that produce 1 mana. Because they cost 3 and only produce 1, they're the worst value that we've seen so far. But they do also, for the most part, have some other little benefit, which may or may not be worth it. Elvish Harbinger, absolutely worth it. Elvish Harbinger allows you to tutor an elf card and put it on top of your library when it comes into play. That should usually be used to get like Beast Whisperer, your card draw elf. If you were to have no other elves in your deck, just Elvish Harbinger and Beast Whisperer, this card would still be good and pretty worthwhile in having in a deck. Just to search for that one other one, because that one other one is a card draw spell that'll draw you cards every time you cast another creature. But obviously she'll go in any elf deck, and you could care about the fact that she'll produce mana of any color, which all of these ones kind of do. So if you are looking for mana fixing, maybe you care about that. But generally speaking, you're going to be better off going with like Cultivates and Kadama's Reaches and ramping in that way for 3 mana and for color fixing purposes. Her benefit is she tutors you up an elf, which presumably should be like a Beast Whisperer or something else that's going to draw you cards. Next, Silhana Starfletcher. She does not tap for, or he does not tap for mana of any color. You have to choose one color when he comes into play, and then it'll tap for that. So in a mono green deck, it's just green, just like the other ones. But if you are playing multicolors, then you do get to at least pick when you cast him what color you want him to tap for. The benefit to this card is that it has reach, and not a whole lot of elves have reach if you're playing an elf tribal deck. And I've made a point of including a few of them, just, the few that I could find. But it is more of a defensive strategy to have reach, and this is a 1/3 body. It's also a 3 mana dork. When in elves, generally you want to go as fast as possible, and they call it elf ball for a reason. You want to snowball into big things and eventually just overwhelm your opponent. Playing a lot of defense isn't, or defensive blocking type creatures doesn't really fit that plan, but it's not a terrible idea to have a few of them in the deck just in case. Rosethorn Acolyte. This one has the benefit of tapping for any color, and then the adventure part of it does give you the option to filter 1 mana before this ever comes into play. So before this is in play, you do have the option in a multicolor deck to filter 1 color for another should you need to. And then finally, Lifespring Druid just taps for a mana of any color. It doesn't have any additional benefit. So, not great for my purposes. And again, I think that if you are playing multiple colors, then you would be better off ramping in other ways rather than a 3-mana mana dork. And the main reason that I would advocate playing this card or this one in Rosethorn Acolyte are if you are just playing a critical mass of mana dorks, and that is your game plan, is just to have as many mana dorks in a deck as possible so that just everything ramps you. Otherwise, there's better options. Next are going to be the elves that kind of tap for a variable amount of mana. Incubation Druid costs 2, and he taps for at least 1 mana, but it does have to be a type that one of your lands could produce. So if you're in multiple colors, it'll produce any color that you need, provided that you have at least one mana source, one land mana source that will already do that. And then you have the option, if he has a 1/1 counter on it, to add 3 mana instead. So, and there's a built-in way to put 3 1/1 counters on him at a cost of 5 mana. But the best way, if possible, is to have a deck that either puts 1/1 counters on stuff somehow, like when they enter the battlefield, or other effects that just do that, and get it on him that way, rather than paying 5 mana to be able to produce 3 instead of 1. Definitely good in elf decks. The color fixing aspect to it is probably not super great, but it is only a 2 mana dork that will color fix you. So that justifies its place in so many decks. Bloom Tender is the most expensive mana dork there is. It's just way expensive. And I understand it from a multiple, like 3, 4, 5 color deck perspective, especially if you're playing competitive, because it only costs 2 mana to get it out there. And it will tap for a mana of, for each color among permanents you control, you get 1 mana of that. So if you have a blue, red, and white permanent out, and obviously he's green, then you would get blue, white, red, and green. You would get 4 mana off this 1 mana dork. For my purposes, in a monocolor deck, he's just going to tap for 1, and at 2 mana, that's not a bad deal, even for me, but for $30, it's not really worth it. I mean, for much cheaper, you could just throw in a Cultivate Kadama's Reach and still have over $25 left over to spend on other things. Then there's Devoted Druid. This one also costs 2 mana, just like the others, and this one will only tap for 1 green, but you can put a -1/-1 counter on it to untap it. So, bare minimum, you can tap it for a green, put a -1/-1 counter on it, tap it for another green. Every turn before or after that, it would tap for 1 green, but at least on 1 turn, you'd be able to produce 2 green off of it. Now, if you have a deck that puts a bunch of 1/1 counters on stuff, especially if it proliferates, then this would go great in that deck as just a way to produce more and more extra mana. I know that there's a few cards that have a way to remove a -1/-1 counter specifically for some benefit. There's just a handful of things like that. If you want to put it in one of those decks, then that would seem appropriate, but that's a pretty narrow and small card pool, so it's not like you would have a whole lot to build around with that if you wanted to go in that direction, like, purposefully. And then there is the green commander. I can't think of the name. 2 mana, and it says your opponents lose infect, and your stuff can't have -1/-1 counters put on it. I do feel that it's worth pointing out that with this, you wouldn't even be able to put the -1/-1 counters on it, because that's part of the cost. You wouldn't be able to abuse that effect in that deck. So, next is Sacellum Godspeaker, and this one is seeing almost no play, which I understand. You have to reveal any number of creatures with power 5 or greater from your hand to get green mana. So if you're playing Elf Ball, he doesn't go in that. If you're playing big creatures, he probably does go in that. He is thematically fits in that. And there is that, what is it, red, white, green commander that, I want to say Mael, that you can pay, I think, 5 mana and look at the top 5 cards of your library for a big creature and then put it in play or something. Yeah, if you're playing a deck that the commander just says right out of the gate you're playing big creatures, this would seem to fit pretty well thematically into that deck, and you're not going to surprise your opponents by playing big creatures when it says right on your commander that that's what you're going to be doing. He would, I mean, he would make a lot of sense in like a Goreclaw deck, because Goreclaw cares about creatures with power 4 or greater and makes them cheaper. I generally don't like revealing a lot of stuff out of my hand. I don't like giving free information, but in a lot of cases, if you're just playing big creatures, showing which ones you happen to have in your hand isn't really telling your opponents a whole lot. And then once you reveal them the first time, every turn thereafter, you keep revealing the same things. You're not giving any additional information. Not a great card. Does have a downside. Maybe you don't care about the downside. Maybe you just want to play it for fun. Then there's Selvala, Heart of the Wilds. This one is seen as a CEDH commander. It definitely has a established style and deck list to it to make it competitive. This one combines card draw as a symmetrical effect with mana ramp and can get you quite a bit of mana. There are ways to go infinite with it, obviously, and it's a very strong card, but it's not usually going to see play in an elf ball deck because all of your elves are going to be pretty small and she won't draw you cards or generate much mana in a deck like that. But if you want to play big giant creatures, she is a great commander for that. Or if you're already playing a deck full of big giant creatures, she's pretty good in the 99 in that as well. Next are two things that are not technically mana dorks, Birchlore Rangers and Heritage Druid. And I do want to point out that they are not mana dorks because when you combine these with Leyline of Anticipation, I believe, Mana Reflection, and the new Ancient Nyxbloom Ancient, those things say that when you tap a permanent for mana, it produces more. These things don't tap for mana, similar to the way Seton works. It is part of the cost of an ability that you tap whatever qualifies. In both of these cases, it's elves. In Seton's case, it's druids. You tap those creatures, and then you, as a result, get the mana. Now, the other things that care, Mana Reflection, Nyxbloom Ancient, and Leyline of, what is it, Anticipation? What those all care about, the creature themselves have to have the ability tap, add mana, which is something that Cryptolith Rite grants. These don't. These don't grant that ability to the elves. So just an important distinction that can be relevant, and maybe you'll find times where you are tempted to play these wrong, or you might notice somebody else play it wrong if those other cards aren't in play. But the upside to these is that they are unaffected by summoning sickness. So if you happen to have one of these guys out and you're playing a bunch of elves, those elves can't do anything because they're summoning sick, but you can still generate mana and get use out of them right out of the gate by using these, and that's why they see play. I understand the reason why Heritage Druid would see a lot more play than Birchlore Rangers, because for Birchlore Rangers, 2 elves equal 1 mana, so it's half a mana per elf. Heritage Druid, 3 elves, 3 mana, 1 full mana per elf. It's a much better card. It does make sense why that one would be much more prominent, but I would think that if you're running Heritage Druid, you should probably want Birchlore Rangers as well, just as a redundant effect, even though it's a much worse redundant effect. Just worth considering. Next are going to be a couple of elves that tap for 3 mana each, Elvish Aberration and Llanowar Tribe. Now Llanowar Tribe is so much better, generally speaking, because if you on turn 1 get a land and a mana dork out, turn 2 you get another land, you can cast him, which means on turn 3 you have 3 lands, a 1 mana producing mana dork, and a 3 mana producing mana dork. You have 7 mana available to you. Elvish Aberration costs a lot more, so he comes out a lot later. Now, once on the battlefield, they do produce the same amount of mana, so it's just the casting cost, which is so much higher. But Elvish Aberration is also bigger, and that can be relevant. It's more playable in like a Goreclaw deck, just as an example. And the Forest Echoing ability should not be entirely dismissed. If this happens to be in like your opening hand and you are kind of light on lands, you are in danger of missing a land drop, you can always pay 2, discard them, get the forest, and then hit your land drop. Also, it is worth pointing out that it says a forest card, which means that if you're playing in multiple colors, then you can get a dual land and fix your colors with them. So you could just look at it as like a 2 mana, almost not rampant growth, because it goes to your hand and you still have to play it as your land per turn. But like a 2 mana way to tutor a dual land to your hand for mana fixing. Either way, the advantage that both of them give are their power toughness. They're both relatively big, which mana dorks are often kind of on the weaker side because you don't care about their power toughness. If they're just going to tap for mana anyway, it doesn't matter. But it is important to have a little bit of variety in their total power toughness when you're playing a card like Wild Pair. Wild Pair should generally see play in a creature-heavy deck, a mana dork-heavy deck, an elf tribal deck, and a lot of the other ones that are maybe 1/1s, they'll get you another thing with total power toughness of 2 out of your library. Llanowar Tribe, because it's a 3/3, it'll get you something total power of 6 out of your library. There are some good creatures that meet that criteria, but generally speaking, if you don't already have it out, you're going to want to get Gilt-Leaf Archdruid. And having some creatures in your deck, including Llanowar Tribe, that are 3/3s, 2/4s, 4/2s, whatever, are going to be extra valuable because when Wild Pair is on the battlefield, casting one of these will get you the very important card draw card. If you're playing, especially if you're playing Elf Tribal or Druid Tribal. And then Elvish Aberration, it's a 4/5, so it has total power toughness of 9. There are no doubt a lot of good things you could get with total power toughness of 9. So including him in a deck partially for the mana dork ability, partially for the ability to get lands early and not be mana screwed, and partially for the ability when Wild Pair is in play to go tutor for another creature that you actually care about. Very valuable. Next are just a couple of the random ones that I didn't really have a better place to talk about them. Skyshroud Troopers, it's a 4 mana dork that produces 1 green. That's the highest cost for the least amount of production from a mana dork standpoint, and because of that, it sees almost no play. It's in 22 decks. No one's playing this card. Unless you are trying to squeeze in every mana dork possible, or if you are playing Wild Pair and you want another thing with total power toughness of 6, so to help you tutor out that Gilt-Leaf Archdruid when you need it, he does help with that. But just strictly looking at him as a mana dork, he costs way too much to produce way too little. But he does have a respectable body that kind of makes up for it, so that when you don't need the mana, you can actually maybe swing in with them or block with them or make him somewhat of an effective creature, an actual battlefield creature. Rishkar Pima Renegade, he puts 1/1 counters on up to two creatures, and each creature with a 1/1 counter on it has tap, add a green. So this is another example that shows exactly the difference between Birchlore, the Birchlore Rangers, and the Heritage Druid. This card gives the creature that has a 1/1 counter on it tap to add mana, which means that anything while Rishkar is out would pair up and kind of combo with Mana Reflection, Nyx Bloom Ancient, and Leyline of Anticipation. So if you are playing Rishkar as a commander, you would almost certainly want to have a lot of effects that put 1/1 counters on your various things. You would probably, if you're doing that, you probably want to have a lot of proliferate effects. Generally speaking, if you have them in your hand or in the command zone, you want to make sure that you get other creatures out first, at least one other creature out first, so that you make the most of his ETB trigger. If you happen to have two creatures out already that don't have Summoning Sickness, you always have the option to put counters on them when he enters, and that gives you 2 extra mana right away to potentially keep doing more stuff. That's about all I can say with him. So that pretty much covers all of the elves that tap for mana, and there is one final note that I want to make clear, because I did bring up not only Gilt-Leaf Archdruid, but I also brought up, or I made it a point to point out some of the other creatures that had total power toughness of 6, so that if you played Wild Pair, you'd be able to tutor out Gilt-Leaf Archdruid. So I want to talk about Gilt-Leaf Archdruid for a moment. Not only is it a very powerful card in a Druid deck, just for the card draw, but also the second ability, it is worth pointing out that if you are planning on running a ton of mana dorks, all elves that produce mana are also druids, except for the 3 you see right now: Elvish Aberration, Beastcaller Savant, and Selvala, Heart of the Wilds. All the other elves that tap for mana are druids. So if you're playing a deck full of mana dorks that are elves, whether it says druid or not on it, and you can check gather if you need to, but this is a blanket statement it's easy to remember. All the elves that tap for mana are druids. So if you're playing a bunch of them, you probably want this card. And if you are playing a bunch of creatures, especially small creatures, you probably want Wild Pair. And if you're playing Wild Pair and you're playing Gilt-Leaf Archdruid, you're going to want a good number of creatures that have total power toughness of 6. And for that reason, some of those other cards that are otherwise not super great or downright bad, like Skyshroud Troopers, which is not a very efficient mana dork, Llanowar Tribe, which is an efficient mana dork and also total power toughness of 6, you're going to want these things to help you get her as well. Also, the Elvish Harbinger tutors you for an elf. If you're playing Gilt-Leaf Archdruid in the deck, this is the elf that you're probably going to go for. That, or, as I previously mentioned, Beast Whisperer or this. And if you already have one of them in play, then you search for the other one. So that pretty much covers it for elves that are mana dorks, and I will be back soon. Thank you.